Get out of my country and never come back. These were the words that shattered 50 years of corporate colonialism in Africa. Ibrahim Traore stood face to face with Richard Morrison, the CEO of the Swiss mining giant Glencore, and delivered the verdict that would kick out the company that had stolen $800 million from Africa. Morrison's face transformed from arrogant confidence to pure shock in seconds. The CEO had walked into the presidential palace expecting another ESI negotiation, only to find himself surrounded by armed guards, furious ministers, and boxes upon boxes of evidence documenting decades of theft, murder, and environmental destruction. "You thought this day would never come," said Traore, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "You thought you could poison our children, steal our wealth, destroy our land forever. You were wrong, Mr. Morrison. Your reign of terror ends now." Cameras were rolling. Every major African news outlet had been secretly invited. International journalists were watching through live feeds. And what they witnessed was the complete demolition of one of the world's most powerful corporations by a 30-something military captain who had decided enough was enough. Behind Traore, massive screens displayed the evidence: satellite images of illegal mining operations that had never been declared, photos of children dying from contaminated water near Glencore mines, bank statements showing millions hidden in offshore accounts, secret recordings of Glencore executives calling African leaders monkeys and laughing about how easy they were to manipulate. "Let me show you what 50 years of Glencore looks like," said Traore, clicking through image after image. "This is Marie, age 7, died from kidney failure caused by mercury poisoning from your illegal gold processing. This is an entire village abandoned because you made the water undrinkable. This is a crater the size of a city where there used to be farmland. These are the real cost of your profits, Mr. Morrison." Morrison tried to speak, tried to deploy his usual tactics, but Traore wouldn't let him. "Your lawyers cannot save you. Your threats mean nothing here. Your bribes are worthless. You have terrorized Africa for half a century. But it ends today. Not tomorrow, not next year, today." The evidence was devastating. Internal Glencore documents showed they knew their operations were killing people, but calculated it was cheaper to pay occasional compensation than to implement safety measures. They had an actual spreadsheet titled African death projections that estimated how many people would die each year from their operations and what the minimal compensation would cost. "You want to know the real genius of your evil?" continued Traore, his disgust evident. "You didn't just steal from us. You made us thank you for it. You paid our officials pennies while taking millions. You built one school while poisoning 10 villages. You donated to charities with money stolen from the people those charities were supposed to help. You turned us into beggars in our own land. Haran, grateful for crumbs from our own table." The ministers around the table were no longer hiding their anger. Many had seen their communities destroyed by Glencore's operations. They had watched relatives die from preventable diseases, while Glencore extracted enough wealth to fund entire healthcare systems. They'd been forced to stay silent by a system that protected foreign corporations over African lives. But now their president was speaking the truths they had been forbidden to voice. Traore pulled up financial records that his team had obtained from whistleblowers. Thus, documents showed the real scale of the theft. In Burkina Faso alone, Glencore had extracted minerals worth $320 million over 2 decades. They had declared profits of less than $40 million. The rest had vanished through transfer pricing, shell companies, and creative accounting that would make criminals blush. $320 million, repeated Traore. "Do you know what we could have built with $320 million? Every single person in Burkina Faso could have had free healthcare, free education, clean water, modern infrastructure. We could have eliminated poverty entirely. Instead, that money bought yachts for your executives, mansions for your shareholders, and politicians in your pocket." The most damning evidence came from Glencore's own servers. A cyber team recruited by Traore had legally accessed files during a security audit. What they found would have been unbelievable if it wasn't documented in such detail. Glencore had intelligence files on every African leader: their weaknesses, their vices, their price tags. They had a department dedicated to compromising officials with everything from bribes to blackmail. "This is my favorite document," said True with bitter sarcasm. "It's your company's African Strategy 2020. Let me read you some highlights. Target younger officials before they develop principles. Exploit tribal divisions to prevent unified resistance. Maintain poverty to ensure desperation and compliance. Never allow local processing of raw materials." These are your actual words, Mr. Morrison. This is your business model. Morrison's lawyers were whispering frantically, but they knew they were beaten. Everything True was revealing was true and backed by evidence. The arrogance that had carried Morrison through decades of exploiting Africa was crumbling. He was being exposed not as a businessman, but as the architect of systematic crimes against humanity. But the revelation that shocked even hardened ministers came next. Traore displayed medical records from areas around Glencore mines. Cancer rates 500% above normal. Birth defects that doctors had never seen before. Water tables poisoned for generations. Glencore knew all of this. They had their own studies. They just calculated that African lives were worth less than safety measures. "You have a formula," said Traore, his voice now shaking with rage. "A mathematical formula for how many African deaths are acceptable for each million in profit. You literally put a price on our lives, and that price was always too cheap. You killed thousands and called it the cost of doing business. Well, Mr. Morrison, today you learned the real cost." Traore stood up and walked directly to Morrison. He pulled out a document and slammed it on the table. "This is your eviction notice. Every Glencore operation in Burkina Faso is now property of the people. Every mine, every truck, every piece of paper. Your bank accounts are frozen. Your assets are seized. Your executives have 24 hours to leave office arrest for crimes against humanity." Morrison finally found his voice. "This is illegal," he stammered. "You can't just, we have contracts. International law will protect us. You'll be sued into oblivion." Traore laughed, a sound without humor. "Sue us with what authority? The same courts that let you murder our children. The same laws that protected your theft for 50 years. No, Mr. Morrison. We recognize no authority that places profits over African lives. Your contracts were signed with traitors and paid for with blood. They are worthless." Security moved forward as Morrison stood up, his expensive suit now soaked with sweat. But Traore had one more card to play. "Before you run back to Switzerland, know this. We've sent everything to every African country where you operate. Ghana, Nigeria, South Africa, Congo, Zambia, Tanzania. They all have the evidence. They're all taking action. Your company is finished in Africa. Not just here, everywhere." The ripple effect was immediate. Within hours of the confrontation going public, Glencore's stock price began its death spiral. Emergency meetings were called in Zurich, London, New York. But it was too late. The evidence Traore had released was being analyzed by governments across Africa, and they were all reaching the same conclusion. They'd been robbed. In Ghana, the president announced an emergency session to review all Glencore contracts. In Nigeria, assets were frozen pending investigation. South Africa launched a judicial commission with subpoena powers. The Democratic Republic of Congo declared all Glencore concessions suspended. It was a continental uprising that no amount of corporate lawyers could stop. But Traore's masterstroke was yet to come. He had assembled a team of international lawyers, not from Western firms, but from countries that had successfully fought corporate exploitation. Brazilian lawyers who had taken on oil companies, Indian advocates who had defeated pesticide manufacturers, Chinese legal experts who understood resource nationalism. They were ready for the legal war that Glencore would wage. More importantly, Traore had built alternatives before striking. He had secretly negotiated with state-owned enterprises from various countries who were willing to buy African minerals at fair prices, transfer technology, train local workers. The monopoly that Glencore had used to dictate terms was already broken. They just didn't know it yet. As Morrison was escorted out, Traore made sure the cameras captured every moment. The once powerful CEO stumbling, the lawyers carrying boxes of worthless contracts, the security ensuring they took nothing that belonged to Burkina Faso. It was more than just an eviction. It was a symbol that the era of corporate immunity was over. 24 hours later, Glencore's evacuation was in full swing. Executives who had lived like kings in gated compounds were scrambling for flights. Documents were being secured by military units to prevent destruction. Equipment was being inventoried for the people's use. And at every mine, workers who had been treated like slaves were celebrating. But the real work was just beginning. Traore personally visited the largest Glencore mine, addressing thousands of workers. "Your days of exploitation are over," he announced. "From today, you work for Burkina Faso, not Switzerland. Your children will benefit from what you extract. Your communities will be rebuilt with the wealth under your feet." The transformation was immediate. Worker salaries were tripled overnight. Safety equipment that Glencore had deemed too expensive was ordered immediately. Plans were drawn up for local processing facilities that would create thousands of jobs. The wealth that had flowed out was redirected inward. International reactions were predictable. Western governments condemned the move. Corporate media painted Traore as a dangerous radical. The World Bank and IMF issued warnings. But something had changed. Other voices were louder. Environmental groups praised the action. Human rights organizations released their own files on Glencore's crimes. Even some Western academics admitted that this was long overdue. The evidence Traore released created a cascade of investigations. In Peru, prosecutors reopened cases about Glencore's copper operations. In Colombia, questions were asked about coal mines. In Kazakhstan, the government demanded answers about oil deals. The company that had seemed untouchable was being investigated on every continent. But the most powerful moment came when Traore visited a village that had been destroyed by Glencore's operations. The water was black. The children were sick. The land was dead. He brought with him not just promises but action teams. Engineers to drill new wells, doctors to treat the poisoned, construction crews to build the hospital that should have existed decades ago. "This is what $800 million stolen looks like," he told the villagers. "But this is also where the healing begins. Your suffering was not in vain. It exposed the criminals. It united Africa. It ended an era of silence. Today, we start building what they prevented us from building." The legal battles were fierce, as expected. Glencore hired the most expensive law firms, filed curses in multiple jurisdictions, threatened sanctions through their government contacts. But Traore had prepared for this. The legal team he assembled didn't just defend, they went on offense. Filing 6 months later, the transformation was undeniable. Mining revenue to the Burkina Faso government had increased by 800%. Employment in the AMIS sector had quadrupled as local processing created jobs. Environmental restoration funded by seized assets was healing decades of damage. And the health crisis in mining areas was finally being addressed with proper medical facilities. The model spread rapidly. Tanzania nationalized idle concessions held by speculators. Zambia demanded local processing of copper. Ghana increased mining royalties by 500%. The Democratic Republic of Congo canceled sweetheart deals and retendered them at fair prices. The race to the bottom, where countries competed to offer the lowest taxes and weakest regulations, was over. In corporate boardrooms across the world, the message was clear. The age of impunity had ended. African resources would no longer be free for the taking. Environmental destruction would have consequences. Corporate executives could face personal criminal liability. The old rules written by and for corporations were being torn up. Richard Morrison's fall from grace was complete. The man who had once dictated terms to presidents was now unemployable. His name had become toxic, associated forever with the exploitation of Africa. He gave an interview months later, still trying to justify his actions, claiming Glencore had broad development. But the images of poisoned children and devastated landscapes made his words sound hollow even to himself. In Burkina Faso, the changes were revolutionary. Mining communities that had lived in poverty despite sitting on millions in resources saw their first real development. Schools with computers and laboratories, hospitals with modern equipment, roads that connected them to markets, clean water that didn't kill, the basics that had been denied while their wealth built Switzerland. Traore institutionalized the revolution. had created citizen oversight committees for every mine, published all contracts online, made revenue figures public in real time, established environmental monitoring by independent bodies. What had been secret was now transparent. What had been stolen was now shared. What had been destroyed was being rebuilt. The success inspired a new generation across Africa. Young people who had felt hopeless about their continent's future saw that change was possible. Students studied mining engineering and environmental science instead of dreaming of escape. Entrepreneurs started local processing businesses. Communities organized to demand their rights. The psychological shift was as important as the economic own. International mining companies watched in horror as their business model collapsed. The days of bribing a few officials and extracting millions were over. Countries were demanding real partnerships, technology transfer, local employment, environmental responsibility, fair pricing. The terms that had seemed impossible were now minimum requirements. Traore's message to other corporate predators was clear. You are not welcome here unless you come as partners, not pirates. We will not accept crumbs from our own table. We will not watch our children die for your profits. We will not remain poor while you get rich from our resources. Those days are over forever. Years later, economists would calculate the impact. The Glencore model had cost Africa over $8 billion in stolen wealth, enough to eliminate poverty across the continent, enough to build world-class infrastructure, enough to educate every child and treat every disease. But that money had instead built the wealth of nations that lectured Africa about development. The day Traore kicked out Morrison became a symbol. December 3rd would be celebrated as Economic Independence Day across Africa. The footage of Morrison stumbling out of the presidential palace played repeatedly on African television. A reminder that the mighty could fall, that exploitation could end, that leaders could serve their people. But Traore always emphasized this was just the beginning. Glencore was one company among many. The system that allowed such exploitation remained. The fight for true economic independence would take generations, but the fear had been broken. The first victory had been won. The path forward was clear. In villages across Africa, where Glencore and companies like it had operated, people felt something they hadn't experienced before. Hope mixed with determination. They had seen their president stand up to power and win. They had seen the untouchable touched, the invincible defeated. If Burkina Faso could do it, they could do it. The spark had been lit. The message to the world was unmistakable. Africa's resources would no longer subsidize Western prosperity. African lives were not acceptable casualties for corporate profits. African leaders who served foreign interests would be exposed and removed. The continent that had been looted for centuries was finally saying enough. Richard Morrison now lived in obscurity, his fortune frozen by various legal actions, his reputation destroyed, his legacy being taught in African schools an example of corporate criminality. He had personified an era of exploitation, and his humiliation personified its end. For Ibrahim Traore, the confrontation with Morrison was not about personal victory. It was about demonstrating that Africa could defend itself, that its resource could serve its people, that its leaders could be incorruptible, that its future could be different from its past. The transformation continued accelerating. Mining revenues funded free healthcare and education. Environmental restoration created thousands of jobs. Local processing industries emerged, creating value chains that had been deliberately prevented. Youth who had seen no future in their countries began to believe in possibilities. The brain drain reversed as diaspora Africans returned to participate in the Renaissance. Western governments and corporations eventually realized they had to adapt. The old model was dead. Countries that wanted African resources would have to offer fair deals, real partnerships, genuine respect. The alternative was being locked out of the fastest-growing markets and most important resources on Earth. When historians write about this moment, they will note that it wasn't just about mining or money or even justice. It was about power. Who wielded it? Who feared it? Who could transform it? For too long, power had flowed in one direction, from the global north to the south, from corporations to countries, from the few to the many. Traore reversed that flow. The courage to say get out to one of the world's most powerful CEOs inspired courage everywhere. Teachers stood up to corrupt education officials. Doctors challenged pharmaceutical companies. Farmers rejected exploitative seed monopolies. The example had been set. Power could be confronted. Power could be defeated. Power could be reclaimed. In the end, the numbers told the story. 800 million stolen from Africa by one company. Thousands dead from preventable poisoning. Entire ecosystems destroyed for profit. But also an 800% increase in government revenues. Thousands of jobs created, hundreds of communities rebuilt, the mathematics of exploitation replaced by the mathematics of development. The Glencore era ended not with a whimper, but with a roar, the roar of a continent finding its voice, the roar of people reclaiming their wealth, the roar of leaders choosing service over submission, the row that announced to the world that Africa is not for sale anymore. Ibrahim Traore had looked exploitation in the eye and said two words, "Get out." And in those two words lay the future of a continent that would no longer accept theft as investment, humiliation as partnership, or poverty as the price of having resources. The looters had been warned. The accomplices had been exposed. The people had been awakened. And it all started with one leader finding the courage to do what should have been done 50 years ago. Tell the thieves to get out and never come back. The revolution had begun, and there was no turning back.